Well, I was talking on the gender dimension of macroeconomics, and basically one aspect of those gender dimension was, as I mentioned, this care economy as a separate entity of the uh, economic system was neglected, basically because of gender, uh, uh, lack of the gender dimension of macroeconomics. But the other aspect is also the lack of the heterogeneity in macroeconomics. Basically, um, society, the fact that the society, well, of course, when we look to the gender dimension, based on two different groups, male and men and women, and men and women are affected differently from them from macroeconomic policies. But actually, we can even make it a little bit more broad and say society is actually based on many different groups, and these different groups are all of them are affected differently. And macroeconomics should also test how this heterogeneity, different aspects of heterogeneity, for example, occupational segregation between men and women, but also maybe occupational segregation of the uh, the, uh, the different, let's say, uh, ethnic groups, or even the immigrants and the natives in a country, how that affects different macroeconomic, trends like growth rates, unemployment, I don't know, things like that. Uh, limits of macroeconomics basically uh, are set because basically the macroeconomics usually looks things from the broad perspective, although well the actual differences, many aspects of gender dimensions, in order to fully cover them. The basic tools of macroeconomics or basic data that can be uh, brought into macroeconomic analysis might be limited. Also, uh, when basically the different aspects of gender dimension of economics is actually studied, certainly uh, different factors that goes even beyond economics are uh, important. So the limits of macroeconomics in looking everything from broad perspective and data uh, might prevent bringing gender dimension, gender differences in full sense into the analysis. So it should be there should be found it should be found that how actually um, the uh, heterogeneity might enter into the macroeconomic analysis. What kind of data might allow it, as well as, for example, in case of in case of the economics of the care or home, uh, without prices, how can we bring the data on the housing sector family into the macroeconomic analysis? We have discussed partially these questions in the previous chapters, but uh, in macroeconomic analysis, we can look a little bit more localized, let's say, data and localized cases to develop macroeconomic theories. But in macroeconomics, basically, we need pretty much nationwide or even global data to make proper macroeconomic analysis, as well as uh, as well as when we are considering macroeconomic tools or policies as a way to change gender relations or heterogeneity, when we look to that effect, we should take into account, that effect is usually more embodied into culture, laws, things like that. So, um, I mean, uh, at the economic conditions at micro and meso level might very well stabilize certain gender um, based characteristics of employment or roles in the economic system, or gender based distribution of them of the um, um, economic roles. So macroeconomics, both when we look to analysis in macroeconomics, but also the macroeconomic tool, the effect of macroeconomic tools in real economics, might have some certain limits because of this. At one point we might, in order to have a more detailed analysis and develop a more better policies, we might look to the meso or micro levels to the issues. Um, Still, of course, macroeconomics might have some effects, and we will see in future in coming parts some of those effects. And to engender macroeconomics, the models, basically, different methods are used. You can see in full detail in the article, but the two most common ones are, well, first, the putting the as we have seen, the unpaid, unmeasured female work, making that visible with data. That's one of the important tasks, and that data should be used then basically to test its effects or the effects on it on the its effects on macroeconomic variables and the effect of macroeconomic variables on the reproductive sector or care economy. And there should be gender disaggregated data, which means, it should be possible to find data separated for men and women, if possible. That data should be created. Um, so these are two most basic aspects of engendering. The models and measurements. In case of models, of course, we should take into account these two different groups are acting. Basically, they are they should be taken into account. We should not act as if there is only one single agent, and all agents are like that agent. And well, basically, the whole project kind of requires both academia to develop models necessary for the uh, gendered analysis of macroeconomics, and then also policymakers first measure the gender effect of their policies, but also develop particular macro policies that also help uh, decreasing, help in the society the uh, gender inequality to decrease. It should play a role in that. And also, of course, the data collecting agents, they should also have an important role. They should provide data for academia and for policymakers that shows how data is disaggregated for women and men. For example, unemployment for women and men should be provided as separate data basically. So that's what basically Çağatay has written in 2003. Now let's continue. Um, Seguino has actually written two articles 10 years apart, and both articles are actually interesting. Uh, it basically, the first article shows globalization as a whole while making markets more flexible, and it removes certain protections from the market. It actually helped women. Actually, it creates conditions that allow women to get into uh, different jobs, including manufacturing jobs, basically. Um, well, the first thing is it increases the flexibility of the labor market. So that's the uh, globalization. Uh, the jobs become less secure, which means you might get into job, but you don't. You don't have guarantee to work in the job for 10 years, 20 years. You might. Uh, it's much more easy to fire a person, and also the job. And uh, ability to get up in the job is relatively more limited. Um, and this is especially so well for the export sector, and in many countries actually export and non-tradable goods sectors are separated, and in some cases specific, as we have seen, specific zones for export production is are created, and the protections of the in the export market, the protections are actually uh, basically uh, labor protections are basically removed. That means there are less unions, and uh, even less state support for labor rights. Um, Easier to fire a person, and jobs in some cases become temporary. For example, even export case, when there's a order that should be able, the company want to be able to increase its labor supply, but then decrease it if it is not anymore that much. Uh, if it doesn't need that many workers anymore, um, and basically, um, with the global slowdown in 2008, actually, it goes all the way to the 1980s. In 1980s, relatively, there was a um increase in the the global economy was doing well in 1980s and 90s to some extent, but compared with 50s and previous eras, it was the world economy was actually not doing that well. And global slowdown basically had decreased the state support to different sectors. And all of these factors actually allowed women to get into to the jobs, because um, but for lifetime jobs, women were usually taught as not reliable workers because they could quit the job when they have children, and the um, on the contrary, for the temporary jobs, actually, they think the women are taught as good workers, and especially when labor rights are moved. Men are still being to organize. So in export sectors, women are taught as workers that are um, relatively better workers, and they already in different parts of the world